Welcome everyone to part 2 of my A Place in the Sun review. This video is going to focus pretty much only on the history of the film. I have a lot of books to get through, so let's just dive in right away with this awesome Montgomery Clift biography written by Patricia Bosworth. So right away I'll start out by saying apparently Monty didn't exactly know who Elizabeth Taylor was before coming into this picture. He didn't know a lot about her. But right away, I'll talk about George Stevens. He said, quote, "I'm one of those directors who believes every element that goes into a picture affects the viewer, although the viewer may not realize the impact of tiny minor things." And he's talking about, such as in this film, you hear the hooting owl throughout different points of the film, or you hear drum beats throughout different parts of the film, little things like that I'm sure people like us notice, and it makes the film that much better. So a favorite ploy of Stevens was to have Monty and Taylor or Monty and Winters run lines for him and then rehearse the scene without speaking, so just looking at each other. Quote, "In such a way it becomes more powerful because you have to communicate your thoughts," Shelley Winters said. And then further on, I believe Monty said this about his character. He said, "He's the kind of guy who has some charm, but basically he conceals and dissembles about everything. He's tacky and not that bright, but he's overwhelmingly ambitious." So he also says he has no style, no sophistication. I don't think Montgomery Clift really liked his character, but I'm sure he enjoyed playing the character. So during the filming of this, Montgomery Clift, and not only in this film, he would travel with a Russian woman named Mira Rostova, and she was basically his trainer. He would rehearse lines with her. So I think she worked on him in plays as well. So he went everywhere with her. So most of Monty's free time was spent conferring with Mira Rostova or arguing over interpretation with George Stevens. Quote, Shepard Strudwick, who played Taylor's father in the film, recalled, quote, "Monty came over to me after a disagreement with Stevens, shaking his head warily and saying, quote, 'I'm right, I know I'm right, but it doesn't make any difference to them. I'm right, and I'll keep saying I'm right.'" He was referring to Shelley Winters' approach to her role. Quote, She's played it all wrong," he told Judy Balaban later. "She played her tragedy from the minute you see her on screen. She is downbeat, blubbery, irritating." He pleaded with Stevens to at least redirect Winters in the remaining scenes so that she would appear more sympathetic. Now, we all know that Shelley Winters played her role in this film perfectly, so I'm glad that George Stevens ignored Montgomery Clift's cries to portray her character differently, because I think her being so annoying was exactly what he was going for, and it worked perfectly. Later, Stevens told the American Film Institute, quote, "The thing that interested me most about Place in the Sun was the relationship of opposing images. Shelley Winters busting at the seams with sloppy melted ice cream as against Elizabeth Taylor in a white gown with blue ribbons floating down from the sky. Automatically, there's an imbalance of images, which creates drama." So true. I mentioned that in my in part 1 of this review. And Elizabeth Taylor, she would say that before making this film, she really didn't feel like she was in a serious acting role. So she had this to say: "It was my first chance to probe myself," Elizabeth Taylor wrote later, "and Monty helped me. It was tricky because the girl is so rich and so spoiled. It would have been easy to play her as absolutely vacuous, I don't know how to say that word. But I think she is a girl who cares a great deal." So they would go over their lines together constantly. In fact, Monty was trained in the theater, and that sort of intimidated Elizabeth Taylor, but they became such amazing friends on set, and they really, really helped each other. And I mentioned this in part 1, but Stevens would say, quote, I wanted to get the feeling of them both totally lost in each other, which we definitely get that feeling from this film. So towards the end of the film, this happened with Montgomery and Clift. Monty could detach himself from everyone when he wanted to, and on the last days of A Place in the Sun, he did just that, shutting himself off with Mira Rostova, speaking to no one, not even Elizabeth Taylor, who was hurt by this behavior apparently. He was trying to prepare himself emotionally for the rigors of the death cell scenes, the first of which he played with his mother, played by Anne Revere, and the chaplain. The second, the goodbye scene with Elizabeth Taylor, and finally walking the last mile. He and George Stevens argued incessantly over how to play the last seconds of the film. The director wanted him to conjure up some awesome, terrifying emotion in the final close-up. Monty argued that a man on his way to the electric chair has no expression. He is numbed, paralyzed, in a state of shock. And I think ultimately Monty got his wish, and he filmed it in that way because he doesn't really show much emotion in the last scene. But he said this: George preconceives everything through a viewfinder. So on the last day of shooting A Place, he refused to give Stevens the, quote, big look he wanted in the death cell. When the cameras rolled, he gave him instead a look which reflects a special kind of agony. His mind and body appear to be floating elsewhere, as if he has punished himself physically and mentally until purged of superficiality. It is that's just what the author of this book had to say, and I agree with that. So I guess Montgomery and Clift just refused to film it in that way. And here's a nice picture from the movie in this book. Oh, not that. There we go. Beautiful picture. Also, guys, I have a new mic stand, which really helps with when I'm reading books and showing pictures. So I'm happy about that. I should have some good pictures of, here we go, of Monty and Liz together when I think they may have been in Italy when they took these pictures playing. They were such good friends. So now we can get into some Elizabeth Taylor books. This is a beautiful book, by the way, written by Randy Taraborelli. And so everyone said that they looked so much alike, that she was like a girl version of him and he was a boy version of her. And in this book it says, if Monty had been heterosexual, there's little doubt that he and Elizabeth would have married. Quote, we really loved each other. Elizabeth Taylor said that in the fullest, complete sense of the word. And also, Elizabeth Taylor really did help Montgomery Clift come out of the closet. In fact, she said this: the men I knew, Monty and Jimmy Dean and Rock Hudson, if anything, I helped them get out of the closet. I didn't even know I was doing it. I didn't know that I was more advanced than most people in this town. It just never occurred to me. And This is an interesting story for when Montgomery Clift eventually had his horrible car accident that he didn't die from, but it left him scarred. In fact, that happened during Raintree County, I think is what it's called, which is another good movie with them. But so Monty left a gathering this is 1956, at the Wildings, which had been attended by Rock Hudson. On his way down a treacherous canyon road, he got in a terrible automobile accident. Elizabeth arrived on the scene shortly afterward to find her friend bloodied almost beyond recognition. His teeth had been knocked down his throat. I hate that line. Preventing him from breathing. Without a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth plunged her hand down his windpipe to clear the blockage. She would have done anything to save him. While she was at his side, photographers began to arrive on the scene. Quote, "If you take one picture of this man in this condition," she told them through her tears, "I swear to God I will not pose for another photo ever." Rock Hudson once recalled it this way, quote, "She prevented the photographers from taking Monty's picture by the foulest language I've ever heard. She shocked them out of taking it. She was saying things like, 'You son of a bee, I'll kick you in the nuts.' The photographers were saying, 'Miss Taylor, you shouldn't be talking like that.' And then 6 of us formed a line to hide Monty. And we said to the photographers, 'Take a picture of us all, we'll smile.' The paparazzi backed off. His head was so swollen, it was almost as wide as his shoulders," Elizabeth later said of Clift's injuries. His eyes had disappeared. Oh my gosh, it sounds horrible. His cheeks were level with his nose, and his upper lip, it was like a spoon, and gouged a great big chunk out of his mouth and teeth. She accompanied Monty to the hospital, not about to leave his side. So, again, Elizabeth Taylor showing she was really a beautiful person. Not just outwardly, but inwardly. And here's another really good book, Liz by David Heyman. So, Elizabeth Taylor said this, "I was absolutely terrified because Monty, first of all, was a New York method-trained actor, and I felt very much the inadequate teenage Hollywood sort of puppet that had just worn pretty clothes and hadn't really acted except with horses and dogs." True. And then this says that Shelley Winters quoted saying this. Winters described Elizabeth as, quote, "a Hollywood baby who had never had the experience of living on her own. What with the coddling and conditioning she had from the studio, she was afraid of the real world and longed for it at the same time." I didn't see her saying that in her autobiography, which we'll get to in a minute. But yeah, there were lots of rumors during the filming of this that Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor were in love and going to get married. In fact, there was a headline in a paper that said, "Clift and Taylor to wed." Of course, we know that didn't happen. So, this is what Rostova, Montgomery Clift's trainer, had to say. "I was on the set. George Stevens clearly didn't necessarily like having me around, but he didn't say much. He had even less to say to the actors. Essentially, he communicated with them through body language and facial expressions. At other times, he would play recordings on a phonograph to help the cast get into a certain mood or frame of mind. Stevens had the reputation of being a kind of fearsome fellow, very severe. There were several times he played his role to the hilt. It turned out Monty coached Elizabeth more than the director did. They rehearsed their scenes for hours. Monty would take copious notes on Liz's performance and then review them with her. Their camaraderie not only helped her acting, it forged a long-lasting tie between them." She also said, "On the other hand, perhaps too much has been made of their friendship. It was primarily Elizabeth who wanted a romantic involvement. Monty would go to bed at night, and she would invariably find some excuse to visit him. She would make him a cup of tea and then maintain she needed to rehearse the following day's scene. Elizabeth always used an aggressive approach concerning men. And then someone from Paramount said, quote, "They looked almost like twins. The dark hair and blue eyes, the incredible facial features. They both possessed an animal magnetism which reverberated off the large screen and filled the darkened movie theater." And then he also said this, "I remember going to lunch with Elizabeth. It was pouring and she drove. She couldn't stop talking about Montgomery Clift. I had the distinct and unmistakable impression that she had fallen in love." So Elizabeth Taylor, one of the most beautiful actresses of all time, just madly in love with Montgomery Clift. On more than one occasion, Elizabeth proposed to Clift, only to have her proposal ignored or brushed aside. One of her letters to Monty read, quote, I love you, I can't live without you, my dear, dear, darling Monty." Interesting. And then Elizabeth's talking about filming on set, specifically about the Lake Tahoe scenes. As Elizabeth recounted the episode, quote, "Lake Tahoe is a glacially cold lake, and it was just miserable that day. Monty and I stood on a wooden float in the middle of the lake. George Stevens sat in a boat with his big boots on and his earmuffs and gloves and made us do take after take after take. I wanted to kill him." In an interview with Look magazine, George Stevens etched a succinct but blah 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 portrait of Elizabeth Taylor. Quote, "She has been kept in a cocoon by her mother, by her studio, by the fact that she's the adored child who has been given everything she has ever wanted since the age of 8. What most people don't realize is there has been a smoldering spirit of revolt in Elizabeth for a long time." Okay, and I think that's everything from that book. So now to the final book, Shelley Winter's autobiography. And there's some good stories in this. First, I'll show this picture that she has with Montgomery Clift. And she said, quote, "The finest actor I ever worked with, and somehow the loneliest." I held myself together. This is all from Shelley Winters' mouth in this book. "I held myself together until we came to my last scene in A Place in the Sun, in which I phoned Monty from the bus station and threatened him." Great scene. "He then leaves the rich people's house where they are celebrating his engagement to Elizabeth. But before that scene, they were doing the end of the picture, which was the prison and execution scene. I don't know if it was because of that time I visited Sing Sing as a child, but I went to Paramount only once while they shot that sequence, even though I admired Anne Revere, that's his Monty, who played Monty's mother. I've seen A Place in the Sun completely through only twice. I always close my eyes after I drown. One time was when Stevens allowed me to see a rough cut in a projection room at Paramount. He was showing it to Miss Theodore Dreiser, Charlie Chaplin, and Henry Ginsberg, who was then head of the studio. The film upset me so deeply I became quite irrational. I turned on my beloved George Stevens and screamed, 'Don't you ever talk to me again as long as I live.' Then I ran to my car. The Paramount guard wouldn't let me drive and took me home to my parents' house." So she has one other good story about this. Okay, this was regarding the abortion clinic scene, or not clinic, but going to the doctor. The director had this to say, "Shelley, this is a scene from the book that I was going to leave out of the film. It's rather censorable, but I think if we handle it delicately, it will illuminate the factory girl's terrible plight. Now get dressed and remember that this girl hasn't slept all night. We'll rehearse the scene once, then shoot it. As the hairdresser combed my hair neatly, I memorized the scene. It was almost an exact copy of the famous scene in the book in which the girl asked the doctor to help her. I had no trouble memorizing it. I had lived it twice. So I guess she dealt with that personally. The doctor was played by Ian Wolfe, a wonderful character who was kindness itself, very easy and quiet to work with. The set was still as death. George blocked and rehearsed the scene once, and the only thing he said to me was, quote, "Remember, Shelley, you need help from this doctor, but you're afraid to tell him exactly what you want. He is your last hope." When he called action, I was already crying. I twisted my white handkerchief into a shredded ball. The scene was 9 minutes long, a full camera load. Boy, did I ever act. When it was over, George said, quote, "Cut and print." I felt I had equaled Bernadette and Deuce. I cried through the whole scene. In fact, I couldn't stop crying. George took me aside and said quietly, "All right, get yourself under control and we'll talk about the scene." I gave him a look of sheer hatred since I thought I had been marvelous. He smiled and said, "We're going to print that take and we'll look at it. Now, Shelley, let's talk about it a little. What are you in this office for?" Of course I had to answer, quote, "To try to get the doctor to help me." If a young girl began to weep in front of a country doctor like that, what would he do? And I had to answer, well, I guess he'd get frightened and ask me to leave. George patted my cheek. He knew what a toll my honesty had cost me. "All right, let's do the scene again. This time try to be very matter-of-fact with the doctor so that you won't frighten him. If you start to cry, stop yourself any way you can. Look out the window. Play with your handkerchief, fix your coat, touch the things on his desk, anything, just don't cry." Of course, when we saw the 2 takes in the next day, the one in which I had followed his exact direction was remarkable, even if I say so myself. One heard the agony in the girl's voice and saw the doctor become careful and frightened of her. In only one place did I get a little out of control, and that was when the doctor said, quote, "Have you got any money?" I shook my head. He hesitated. "Well, you will make a very healthy mother." Every time I've seen that scene in a theater, which I guess it would be 2 times because she said she's only seen it twice, in a theater, every man in the audience groans and every woman weeps. George had taught me another lifelong acting lesson. Don't indulge yourself. Make the audience weep. So that's all the literature I have on A Place in the Sun. We got through it. Lots of interesting stories, lots of crazy dynamics going on set, especially between the director, Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift, Shelley Winters, lots of big characters. I hope you enjoyed this mega review 2-parter. Please leave a like, please leave a comment, and I hope to see you all in future reviews with me.